Thank you, Debula, and welcome to Liverpool. When I say Liverpool, you think about Liverpool football clubs or the Beatles. But do you know that Europe's oldest black community lives here? Yes, black people, including sailors and sons of African leaders, have been living here since the 1750s. But there's also an incredibly darker side to Liverpool's history. Behind me is the Royal Albert Docks, part of UNESCO World Heritage Site. Today, it is the city's most popular tourist attraction. But 250 years ago, ships would leave here going to get a cargo from Africa, and that cargo was the slaves. The ship would travel from here to Africa before picking up slaves and taking them on to America and the Caribbean. It was profit made from this inhumane trade that funded structures like this. The growth and wealth of Liverpool and other British cities. I came here to find out how the slave trade started in the UK. It is said that this man, Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, came up with the idea of the transatlantic slave trade. He made Portugal the first European nation to engage in the slave trade from the mid-15th century. He followed countries such as Spain, Britain, France, Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. Africans were taken against their will and forced onto slave ships. They were then transported across the Atlantic Ocean. Slavery was supported and made legal by European government and monarch. This type of enslavement was practiced in European colony from the 16th century onwards. Captain John Hawkins made the first known English slavering voyage to Africa in 1562 in the reign of Elizabeth I. It was called the transatlantic slave trade because it formed a triangle route across the ocean. How did it actually work? The trader would leave European ports towards the African west coast. There, they capture Africans, load them into the ships. They sail across the Atlantic Ocean to America. Those Africans who had survived the journey were sold and put to work as slaves. Once the ship unloaded the slaves, they then returned to Europe with goods such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and later cotton, which has been produced by slave labor. The triangle, which involved 3 continents, was then completed. Millions of Africans were enslaved and forced across the Atlantic to labor in plantations in the Caribbean and Americas. This led to generation after generation of people being taken from their homelands. Where did the ship arrive in Europe? The main European ports that were involved in the slave trade were Liverpool, London, Bristol, other European ports such as Amsterdam, Barcelona, Bordeaux, and Nantes. There were loads of resistance by Africans against slavery, like L'Amour
d'Errance, who was a slave turned rebel, then became a general.
And Olaudah Okiano, born in modern-day Nigeria. But the most successful slave rebellion in history was the 18th century Haitian Revolution, led by former slave Toussaint Louverture and later by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who won the war against the French colonial rulers. This founded modern-day Haiti. This became the only place where slaves freed themselves and created their own country. It is thought that more than 1.5 million people were sent to slavery with ships made or sent from here. At its peak, 3/4 of all European slaving ships were set up from here, many going to modern-day Nigeria, where Kesha went to find out what happened once they arrived there.
Would you believe that one of these cannons was traded for the lives of 100 human beings? Here I am in the compound of what would have been the home of Chief Moby. He was one of many chiefs at the time who worked with foreign invaders to capture people for sale. Here in this museum, relics from that time are housed. For example, this device is called a neck lock. It would have been worn around the neck like this and held together with chains like these, which are really, really heavy. And that's how the slaves would have been shackled together. And to give you some context, 10 slaves would have been traded for a single bottle of rum. After the slaves were bought at market, they would have been stored in what was essentially a warehouse, the Brazilian barracoon. It has 40 rooms, and each of these rooms would have housed 40 slaves. So this is the outer room where the slaves would have been checked to make sure they were healthy before being stored in the room in the back. Let's take a look at that. So it's quite dark, but we've got some light. It's also really hot. It's not a big space. Now it's being used to house some relics from that time, but it's a 9 by 9 space, and 40 people would have been stored in here for months on end while they waited for ships. So once a ship became available, the slaves would be put onto little boats or canoe-type vehicles and transported across the lagoon from the mainland to this island, which is where we're heading to now. And all the final preparations for their move across the Atlantic would take place. Now we're on Barrow Island, and it's been reported that as many as 500,000 people were sold into slavery from here between 1510 and 1880. It's also here that the slaves would have been divided based on gender and age. So I was just looking at what is known as the Spirit Well, and it's the second to the last stop on the slave route to Badagry's point of no return. At the time, captives were given water from this well to drink, and it's believed that as they did this, all memories and connections to home would be severed, and they wouldn't remember or think of anything except their new lives as slaves. Locals to this island say that no one has drunk from this well in more than a century. The path I'm walking along is called Ocean Path, and it's the walk from the well down to the final stop, which is the point of no return. And this is the last stop, the point of no return. It's along these shores that hundreds of thousands of people would have been handed over to Europeans and headed for new lives across the Atlantic, never to return home again.
In 1852, slavery was formally abolished with the signing of several treaties here in Badagry, but it wasn't until 34 years later that ruling chiefs at the time put a definitive end to the trade by stopping it from happening illegally.
The last slaving ship left here in 1807. In recent years, the city has been confronting this period of its past. In 1999, the City Council made a formal apology for the city's role in the slave trade.